The moment the billionaire realized the quiet waitress spoke better Mandarin than his entire executive team, the $400 million deal was already seconds away from collapsing. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of LeClaire House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive private restaurants, while soft jazz drifted through the golden light of crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved carefully between marble tables carrying silver trays worth more than most people's monthly rent. At the center of the dining room, surrounded by investors, attorneys, and international executives dressed in dark tailored suits, Adrian Mercer checked his Swiss watch for the third time in less than 2 minutes. His jaw tightened slightly. Across from him sat representatives from one of Shanghai's largest technology firms, their expressions unreadable behind polite smiles and untouched cups of jasmine tea. Everything about the evening had been designed for perfection. The lighting, the menu, the imported wine flown in from Napa that same morning. Adrian Mercer did not believe in failure, especially not public failure. At 38, the CEO of Mercer Holdings had built a reputation on precision and control. Wall Street called him ruthless. Business magazines called him brilliant. His employees simply called him intimidating when he wasn't around to hear it. But tonight, something felt wrong. The tension at the table had shifted almost an hour ago, subtle enough that most people would have missed it. Adrian didn't. He noticed the shorter responses from the Chinese delegation, the forced smiles, the growing silence after every translated sentence. Beside him, the company's interpreter nervously adjusted his tie and repeated another line in Mandarin, his voice slightly unsteady now. One of the older executives across the table slowly placed his teacup onto the saucer. Softly, carefully. Somehow, that quiet sound echoed louder than the jazz music. Adrian's eyes narrowed. He knew enough about negotiations to understand one thing. Silence was never empty. Silence meant danger. Nearby, Evelyn Carter stood beside a service station refilling water glasses no one had touched. Most guests never noticed her. She moved too quietly for that. Blonde hair tied neatly at the back of her neck. Simple black uniform. Calm blue eyes that rarely lingered anywhere too long. To the billionaires and executives filling LeClaire House every weekend, she was background scenery. Another invisible waitress carrying polished silver trays beneath warm Manhattan lights. But Evelyn noticed everything. She noticed the interpreter mistranslating a phrase nearly 20 minutes earlier. She noticed the uncomfortable glance exchanged between the Chinese executives after the word family obligation had been translated incorrectly. And she noticed Adrian Mercer growing colder with every passing minute, though he still believed he controlled the room. Then it happened. The interpreter smiled nervously and delivered another sentence in Mandarin. The oldest Chinese executive's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Worse, disappointment. He leaned back slowly in his chair and spoke quietly to the others beside him. One by one, folders began to close around the table. Adrian felt his pulse sharpen. "Is there a problem?" he asked evenly. The interpreter hesitated before translating. The response came back short. Too short. Adrian stared hard at the man beside him. What did he say? The interpreter swallowed. They may reconsider the partnership. A heavy silence settled over the table. Rain streaked against the glass high above Manhattan, while the city lights blurred into gold beneath the storm. And from several feet away, barely louder than a whisper, Evelyn Carter finally spoke. "Sir, that's not what he meant at all." Every conversation in the restaurant seemed to disappear at once. The soft clinking of silverware stopped. Even the pianist near the marble staircase missed a note. Adrian Mercer slowly turned toward the voice behind him, irritation already rising in his chest before he even saw who had spoken. It was the waitress, the quiet one, the blonde girl carrying water glasses and wine bottles all evening without drawing attention to herself. Evelyn Carter stood beside the service station holding a silver tray against her black uniform. Her expression calm despite every executive at the table now staring directly at her. For a second, nobody moved. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Excuse me," he said coldly. Evelyn hesitated only long enough to set the tray down carefully beside the espresso machine. The interpreter translated the phrase incorrectly, she said softly. He did not say they were reconsidering the partnership. The company interpreter immediately straightened in his chair. That is exactly what was said. But Evelyn shook her head once. Calmly, respectfully. "No, sir," she replied. He said your response dishonored his father's legacy. That is very different. A subtle shift passed across the faces of the Chinese executives. The oldest among them lifted his eyes toward Evelyn with visible surprise. Adrian noticed it instantly. His jaw tightened. And you suddenly speak fluent Mandarin? The question came sharper than he intended. Nearby, one of the younger investors let out a quiet laugh beneath his breath. Another executive exchanged an amused glance with someone beside him. Adrian barely noticed. His attention stayed fixed on Evelyn Carter. She did not look embarrassed. That irritated him more than if she had. Most people became nervous when he looked at them that way. Most people rushed to apologize. Evelyn simply stood there beneath the warm chandelier light, while rain rolled down the dark windows behind her. Enough to understand what he actually said, she answered. Her voice remained calm. Steady. Adrian leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her for the first time that evening. She looked young, mid-20s maybe. Nothing about her suggested international business negotiations or foreign diplomacy. No designer suit. No executive posture. Just a waitress with tired blue eyes and careful hands that looked more accustomed to carrying porcelain plates than correcting billion-dollar discussions. Yet something about the way she spoke unsettled him. Not confidence exactly. Certainty. Across the table, the older Chinese executive suddenly spoke again in rapid Mandarin, his tone measured this time. The interpreter froze for a fraction of a second before attempting to respond, but Evelyn quietly interrupted. He asked whether anyone at this table understands the meaning of familial respect in Chinese business culture. The room fell silent again. Adrian slowly looked toward his interpreter. The man's face had begun to pale beneath the restaurant lighting. That was all the confirmation Adrian needed. A mistake had been made. A serious one. The kind that could destroy months of negotiations in less than 5 minutes. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the delegation before continuing carefully. The phrase he used cannot be translated literally. In Mandarin, the wording carries emotional context tied to honoring previous generations. The translation came across sounding dismissive. Adrian felt tension tighten across his shoulders. The older executive nodded once toward Evelyn, then finally spoke directly to her instead of the interpreter. This time the Mandarin came faster, more complex. Several executives around the table shifted awkwardly, completely lost now. But Evelyn answered immediately, smoothly, naturally. Her pronunciation was flawless. Not rehearsed, not academic, real. The kind learned through years of speaking, listening, understanding. One investor near the end of the table slowly lowered his wine glass in disbelief. Another executive muttered, "Holy hell," beneath his breath. Adrian Mercer said nothing at all. For the first time that evening, the most powerful man in the room was no longer controlling the conversation. And somehow, the quiet waitress standing beside the espresso machine suddenly was. The older executive listened to Evelyn in complete silence, his sharp eyes never leaving her face as she answered each sentence in smooth Mandarin without hesitation. Around the table, confusion slowly turned into disbelief. Adrian Mercer could feel it happening in real time. The energy in the room had changed. 10 minutes ago, everyone had been watching him. Now they were watching her. Evelyn stood beside the long marble table beneath the warm chandelier light, one hand resting lightly against the back of an empty chair. Calm, composed, almost strangely unaffected by the fact that she had just stepped into the middle of a collapsing international negotiation worth nearly $500 million. The Chinese executive finally gave a slow nod and replied with a softer tone than before. Evelyn listened carefully, then translated without rushing. He says respect matters more than numbers. Your company focused only on percentages and timelines. Their company wanted to know whether you understood the people behind the contract. A heavy silence followed her words. Adrian's legal team exchanged uncomfortable glances. One investor loosened his tie slightly. Somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a wine glass clinked softly against a tray before disappearing again into the low hum of distant conversation. Adrian leaned forward slowly, studying Evelyn more carefully now. "And you understood that?" he asked. Evelyn met his gaze evenly. "My mother taught me that language changes depending on what people are protecting emotionally." The answer lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Adrian noticed the way the older executive's expression softened slightly after hearing her translation. It was subtle, but enough. Business negotiations were rarely decided by spreadsheets alone. Sometimes they were decided by whether someone felt respected sitting across the table. Adrian knew that. He had built an empire understanding human behavior, which made this moment even more unsettling. Because somehow, the waitress understood the room better than his own executive team did. The interpreter cleared his throat nervously. I may have simplified the context slightly. Adrian turned his head slowly toward him. The expression in his gray eyes turned dangerously cold, though his voice remained controlled. Slightly. Nobody answered. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, while thunder rolled somewhere far above the city skyline. Evelyn gently reached for the untouched teapot near the center of the table and refilled the older executive's cup before he even asked. The man looked genuinely surprised by the gesture. Then he smiled for the first time all evening. Small, brief, real. Evelyn returned the polite smile naturally before stepping back again. No performance. No attempt to impress anyone. Adrian noticed that too. Most people changed when powerful men paid attention to them. They straightened their posture, spoke louder, tried harder. Evelyn Carter did the opposite. The more attention the room gave her, the quieter she seemed to become. One of Adrian's investors finally leaned closer and whispered, "Where exactly did you find her?" Adrian ignored the question because he did not know the answer himself. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The older executive suddenly spoke again, this time directly toward Adrian. Evelyn translated carefully. "He says the deal can still move forward tonight, but only if trust is restored first." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "And how does he expect that to happen?" Evelyn listened again before answering. "He wants honesty. No more polished corporate language. No more scripted negotiation tactics." Another silence settled over the table. Adrian Mercer had spent 20 years mastering controlled conversations, calculated leverage, strategic pressure. Now a waitress in a black uniform was quietly informing him that the only way to save the biggest deal of the year was to stop acting like a billionaire for 5 minutes and start acting like a human being. And somehow, deep down, Adrian already knew she was right. For several long seconds, Adrian Mercer said nothing at all. He simply sat there beneath the golden chandelier light, fingers resting against the edge of the crystal wine glass in front of him, while rain rolled slowly down the dark Manhattan windows behind him. The entire table waited for his response. His investors, his legal team, the executives from Shanghai. Even the pianist near the staircase seemed to lower the volume instinctively, as though the restaurant itself understood something important had shifted. Adrian was not accustomed to silence he did not control. Usually, people rushed to fill empty space around him. Employees explained themselves too quickly. Executives apologized before he even spoke. Competitors became nervous under the weight of his attention alone. But Evelyn Carter stood calmly beside the table without trying to impress anyone, and somehow that unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. The older Chinese executive lifted his teacup again, waiting patiently. Adrian finally exhaled slowly and loosened the tension in his jaw. "Tell him," he said quietly, eyes still fixed on Evelyn, "that Mercer Holdings values legacy. I understand what I failed to recognize tonight." Evelyn studied him for half a second, as if measuring whether he truly meant the words. Then she translated smoothly into Mandarin. The executive listened carefully. His expression softened slightly again. Another reply followed, slower this time. Evelyn nodded once before turning back toward Adrian. "He says respect is proven through humility, not presentation." One of Adrian's attorneys shifted awkwardly in his seat. Another executive stared down into his untouched bourbon as if suddenly fascinated by the ice melting inside the glass. Adrian noticed all of it. The discomfort, the uncertainty, the fact that everyone at the table now understood the waitress had saved them from disaster. Yet Evelyn herself behaved as though none of it mattered. She simply stood there in her modest black uniform while the storm outside painted silver streaks across the glass skyline of Manhattan. Adrian found himself watching her hands when she spoke. Calm hands, careful hands. Not once had they trembled. Not once had she tried to dominate the room. That level of control usually came from power. Or pain. Sometimes both. The Chinese executive suddenly smiled faintly and spoke directly to Evelyn again. This time her eyes widened just slightly before she translated. "He says your Mandarin sounds like someone who learned it from family, not textbooks." A strange quiet settled over her expression for the first time that evening. Small, brief, but Adrian caught it immediately. Evelyn lowered her eyes for less than a second before answering the executive softly in Mandarin. Whatever she said made the older man nod with visible understanding. Adrian leaned forward slightly. What did you tell him? Evelyn hesitated. That my mother believed language only matters if people feel seen when you speak to them. The answer landed harder than Adrian expected. He looked away briefly toward the rain-covered city beyond the windows. Somewhere 30 floors below, Manhattan traffic crawled through wet streets glowing gold beneath traffic lights and taxi headlights. For the first time all evening, Adrian no longer cared about the contract numbers sitting inside the folders around the table. He cared about something else now. Something he could not immediately define. Curiosity, perhaps. Or discomfort. Maybe both. One of the investors finally laughed nervously. Well, he muttered, I guess we should offer her a consulting position before another company does. A few strained chuckles followed around the table. Evelyn did not laugh. Adrian noticed that too. Most people would have smiled at the compliment. Maybe blushed. Maybe used the moment to ask for opportunity or recognition. Evelyn simply reached for the empty water pitcher beside her and quietly refilled another glass like none of this had anything to do with her at all. And somehow, that simple gesture said more about her than any resume ever could. The atmosphere at the table slowly began to thaw after nearly an hour of tension, but Adrian Mercer could still feel the embarrassment sitting heavily beneath the polished surface of the evening. His executives spoke more carefully now. His legal team listened before interrupting. Even the interpreter remained silent except when absolutely necessary. Somehow, the quiet waitress standing beside the marble table had changed the behavior of an entire room filled with powerful men without raising her voice once. Evelyn Carter continued translating calmly between both sides while servers moved discreetly around the restaurant carrying plates of sea bass, filet mignon, and expensive wine no one seemed particularly interested in anymore. The business deal had become secondary to something else now. Respect, trust, human connection. Strange words for a room normally obsessed with leverage and percentages. Adrian watched Evelyn carefully every time she spoke Mandarin. There was rhythm in the way she translated. Not mechanical, not rehearsed. She listened fully before responding, as though she understood emotion first and language second. That detail stayed with him. Across the table, the older executive suddenly smiled while looking directly at Adrian. Evelyn translated softly. He says your company finally sounds honest tonight. Several people at the table visibly relaxed after hearing that. One attorney even let out a breath of relief loud enough to earn a glance from the others. Adrian gave a small nod, though his attention never fully left Evelyn. Ask him if we may continue the discussion in Shanghai next month, Adrian said. Evelyn translated immediately. The executive responded with what sounded almost amused. She paused before translating back. He says yes, but only if you bring the waitress. A ripple of surprised laughter moved around the table. Even Adrian smiled slightly despite himself. Evelyn did not. She lowered her eyes briefly toward the polished silverware in front of her before answering in Mandarin again, clearly trying to redirect the attention away from herself. The executive laughed warmly this time. Adrian noticed something important then. Evelyn was uncomfortable being praised. Not falsely modest. Genuinely uncomfortable. She did not want admiration. She wanted the conversation to move forward and disappear past her quietly. That alone made her different from almost everyone Adrian knew. The dinner slowly resumed after that. Wine glasses refilled. New documents reopened. Signatures no longer seemed impossible. Outside, the rain over Manhattan softened into a steady shimmer against the city lights, while jazz piano drifted gently through the restaurant again. Yet Adrian could not focus on the contract in front of him anymore. His attention kept returning to Evelyn Carter. Who was she really? Nobody learned Mandarin at that level casually. Not in New York. Not while working double shifts carrying plates in a restaurant. At one point during the conversation, one of the Chinese executives mentioned a proverb in Mandarin. Evelyn translated it smoothly into English. The loudest river is rarely the deepest. Adrian looked at her after hearing the words. Something about the sentence felt uncomfortably accurate tonight. An hour ago, he had entered the restaurant believing he controlled every variable in the room. Now, the only person he truly wanted answers from was the woman quietly collecting empty glasses near the edge of the table. Eventually, the meeting reached its conclusion. Contracts remained unsigned for now, but the disaster had passed. The executives from Shanghai rose one by one, shaking hands with Adrian and his team before preparing to leave. The older executive stopped in front of Evelyn last. He spoke gently in Mandarin while offering a respectful nod. Evelyn's expression softened in a way Adrian had not seen all evening. She replied quietly, and the man smiled before walking away beneath the warm chandelier glow. Adrian waited until the delegation disappeared toward the elevators before finally turning toward her. "What did he say to you?" Evelyn reached for the empty teacups before answering. "He said people who speak softly often carry the heaviest stories." Adrian stared at her for a moment longer than intended. Then for the first time that evening, Evelyn Carter looked away first. The elevators closed behind the Shanghai delegation with a soft metallic sound that seemed to release the entire restaurant from holding its breath. Conversations slowly returned around the dining room. Glasses clinked again. A waiter near the bar laughed nervously with relief while polishing champagne flutes beneath the warm amber lights. But at Adrian Mercer's table, the silence remained. His executives gathered documents quickly, avoiding eye contact after the embarrassment earlier in the evening. The interpreter left first without saying much to anyone. Adrian barely noticed. He was still watching Evelyn Carter as she stacked porcelain plates onto a silver tray with quiet precision. "Excellent recovery tonight, Adrian," one investor finally said while fastening his coat. "Could have gone very differently." Adrian gave a distracted nod. "It almost did." The investor glanced briefly toward Evelyn before lowering his voice. "You should seriously consider hiring her." Adrian did not answer immediately. He simply watched Evelyn thank another server softly before carrying the tray toward the kitchen entrance. The investor mistook his silence for agreement and continued speaking. "Someone that composed under pressure does not belong carrying dinner plates." Adrian finally looked away from Evelyn long enough to respond. "Maybe she belongs exactly where she chooses to be." The investor raised an eyebrow at that. Most people in Adrian Mercer's world viewed life as hierarchy. Everyone was either climbing upward or falling behind. The idea that someone intelligent might willingly choose simplicity confused them. Adrian used to think the same way. Until tonight. 20 minutes later, the restaurant had nearly emptied. Rain still shimmered across the Manhattan skyline outside, turning the streets below into rivers of gold and red reflections. Adrian remained seated alone at the long table long after his executives had left. His untouched whiskey sat melting slowly beside the contract folders. He should have gone back to the office already. There were emails waiting, market reports, calls from Tokyo scheduled before sunrise. Instead, he found himself staring toward the kitchen corridor every few seconds without understanding why. Then Evelyn finally reappeared carrying a small cardboard box filled with clean wine glasses. Her blonde hair had loosened slightly from the long shift, though she still moved with the same quiet calm as before. Adrian stood before he fully realized he was doing it. Evelyn stopped when she noticed him approaching. "Mr. Mercer," she said politely. "The kitchen closes in 15 minutes if you still need anything." Adrian almost laughed at the absurd normalcy of the sentence after the night they had just survived. "I think you already saved everything I needed tonight." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly, clearly uncomfortable with compliments again. "I only corrected a misunderstanding." Adrian studied her expression carefully. "Most people would have stayed quiet." "Most people do," she answered softly. The honesty of the response caught him off guard. Nearby, a dishwasher rattled faintly behind the kitchen doors while jazz music drifted low through the nearly empty restaurant. Adrian slipped one hand into the pocket of his tailored coat. How does a waitress in Manhattan speak Mandarin like that? Evelyn adjusted the glasses carefully inside the box before answering. "The same way anyone learns a language. Time. Listening. Mistakes." That is not an answer. A faint smile touched the corner of her lips for the first time all evening. "Small. Tired. Real. Maybe I do not owe you one." Adrian stared at her for a second before unexpectedly smiling back. Most people feared challenging him directly. Evelyn did it without aggression, without performance, just honesty. And somehow that made it impossible for him to be angry. She shifted the weight of the box slightly in her arms. Adrian noticed then that her hands looked exhausted. tiny marks from hot plates near her fingers, redness around her knuckles from hours of work. Not delicate hands. Hard-working hands. You should not still be here, Evelyn said quietly. People like you usually leave first. Adrian glanced toward the rain beyond the windows. People like me usually think they understand everyone in the room. His eyes returned to hers slowly. Tonight proved otherwise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights flickered softly against the glass while somewhere outside a taxi horn echoed through the wet Manhattan streets. Then Evelyn looked down at the cardboard box in her arms and said the one thing Adrian Mercer could not stop thinking about for the rest of the night. The loudest people are rarely the ones carrying the hardest stories. Adrian Mercer did not sleep that night. By 2:30 in the morning, the rain over Manhattan had faded into a cold mist drifting between glass skyscrapers. But the words Evelyn Carter spoke inside LeClaire House still echoed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. The loudest people are rarely the ones carrying the hardest stories. He sat alone inside the back seat of his Blacktown car, while city lights slid silently across the windows beside him. His driver occasionally glanced through the mirror, waiting for instructions that never came. Usually after major negotiations, Adrian's mind moved immediately toward strategy. Market impact, investor reactions, expansion projections. Tonight, none of those thoughts stayed long. Instead, he kept seeing a waitress calmly correcting an international negotiation while billionaires sat speechless around her. He kept hearing flawless Mandarin spoken with quiet confidence from someone the entire room had ignored less than an hour earlier. Most of all, he kept thinking about the strange sadness behind her eyes whenever someone praised her. By 3:15, Adrian finally arrived at Mercer Tower overlooking Park Avenue. The 63rd floor office was silent except for the faint hum of city traffic far below. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the dark skyline, while a half-finished bottle of expensive scotch sat untouched beside his desk. His assistant had left printed reports neatly stacked under the warm desk lamp hours earlier. Tokyo market updates, merger projections, overnight legal summaries. Adrian ignored all of them. Instead, he pressed a button on the desk phone. Daniel. A tired voice answered almost immediately. It is 3 in the morning, Adrian. I need information. A long pause followed. About. Adrian stared out toward the sleeping city. A waitress. Silence again. Then a quiet laugh. Now I know you are exhausted. I am serious. Daniel Harper had worked private intelligence for Mercer Holdings nearly 12 years. Former federal analyst. Brilliant researcher. Completely unshockable. But even he sounded confused now. You are calling me at 3:17 in the morning because of a waitress? Adrian loosened his tie slightly. Her name is Evelyn Carter. She works at LeClaire House. And what exactly did this waitress do? Adrian hesitated for a moment before answering. She prevented $400 million from collapsing because my entire executive team failed to understand basic cultural diplomacy. Another silence followed. Different this time. Interested. Daniel's tone shifted immediately. Oh. Adrian walked slowly toward the office windows, watching mist drift between the buildings below. I want a background report by morning. How detailed? Everything. Daniel exhaled quietly. You rarely say that unless someone concerns you. Adrian looked down at the wet Manhattan streets 30 floors below. She concerns me because she should not exist. Meaning, people do not spend years mastering Mandarin and international negotiation skills to carry trays in restaurants. Daniel typed something quickly on the other end of the line. All right, I will see what I can find. Adrian ended the call and remained standing beside the window long after the office fell silent again. Somewhere deep below, taxi headlights cut through the wet streets like moving gold reflections beneath the fog. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something unfamiliar pressing against the carefully controlled structure of his life. Curiosity mixed with guilt. He thought about the moment he dismissed Evelyn earlier in the evening. Go back to serving tables. The memory sat heavily in his chest now. She had not defended herself, had not tried to embarrass him afterward. She simply stepped forward, solved the crisis, and quietly returned to work. That level of restraint unsettled him more than arrogance ever could. At 6:40 the next morning, Daniel finally called back. Adrian answered immediately. Papers shuffled softly on the other end. Well, Daniel said slowly, your waitress is not exactly who she appears to be. Adrian remained silent. Daniel continued. Evelyn Carter, 27 years old, former Columbia University student, full academic scholarship, specialized in Asian political diplomacy and international language studies. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. He knew it. There is more, Daniel added quietly. A lot more. Morning sunlight spilled softly across the glass walls of Mercer Tower, turning the skyline pale gold as Adrian Mercer stood motionless beside his office window listening to Daniel Harper continue reading from the report. The city below had already awakened. Yellow taxis crawled through traffic. Steam rose from street vents into the cold Manhattan air. Somewhere beneath all that movement, millions of people rushed through another ordinary morning completely unaware that a waitress had become the only thing occupying the mind of one of the most powerful men in New York. Daniel's voice remained calm over the speakerphone. Evelyn Carter graduated top of her class during her first 2 years at Columbia. Professors described her as exceptional, especially in negotiation psychology and East Asian diplomacy. Adrian said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the skyline, while he loosened the cuff of his dark dress shirt absent-mindedly. There are records of academic awards, Daniel continued. Language immersion programs in Beijing and Shanghai. Fluent Mandarin. Conversational Cantonese. Some Japanese. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. A waitress carrying wine glasses in Manhattan should not have had that resume. Why did she leave school? He asked quietly. Papers shuffled again. This time Daniel hesitated. That part gets complicated. Adrian turned slowly from the window. Meaning? 3 years ago her mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The office suddenly felt quieter after that sentence. Adrian walked slowly toward his desk, but did not sit down. Daniel continued carefully now. Medical records show Evelyn withdrew from Columbia within 2 weeks of the diagnosis. Full scholarship disappeared afterward because she could no longer maintain enrollment. Adrian looked down at the polished wood desk in silence. He thought about Evelyn's hands carrying heavy trays late into the night, the exhaustion around her eyes, the strange sadness behind every compliment she avoided. Daniel kept talking softly. Her mother immigrated from Guangzhou almost 30 years ago, worked as a seamstress in Queens, raised Evelyn alone after her husband died. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. So she learned Mandarin from her mother. Looks that way. There is more. Adrian leaned one hand against the desk. Go ahead. Hospital bills. Daniel paused. A lot of them. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. Daniel rarely sounded emotional discussing background reports. But this time something in his voice had shifted. Evelyn has been working multiple restaurant jobs for nearly 3 years to pay for long-term memory care treatment. Adrian stared silently across the office. Suddenly, he remembered every detail from the night before with painful clarity. The tiny burns on her fingers, the fatigue hidden beneath her calm expression, the fact that she never once tried to turn attention into opportunity. Most people in difficult situations looked for leverage wherever they could find it. Evelyn had protected her dignity instead, even when carrying exhaustion on her shoulders every single day. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. There is one more thing you should probably know. Adrian looked toward the skyline again. What? Several international firms tried recruiting her before she left school, including a diplomatic consulting agency in Washington. Adrian let out a slow breath through his nose. Of course they had. Someone like Evelyn Carter did not simply disappear unnoticed. She disappeared by choice. The realization unsettled him deeply. Most people spent their lives chasing status, money, recognition. Evelyn had walked away from all of it to care for someone else. And somehow she did it without bitterness. Adrian thought back to the restaurant again. The way she quietly refilled teacups while executives praised her. The way she looked uncomfortable every time attention shifted toward her. She never acted like someone cheated by life. Just someone carrying responsibilities too heavy to set down. Daniel finally asked the question Adrian himself had been avoiding since sunrise. Why exactly are you interested in her? Adrian remained silent for several seconds. Then he walked slowly back toward the giant office windows overlooking Manhattan and answered honestly for the first time. Because everyone in that room last night thought she was insignificant. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Tired eyes. Perfect suit. $1 billion reputation. Including me. That evening, Manhattan glowed beneath a cold silver rain as Adrian Mercer stood across the street from Leclerc House for nearly 10 full minutes before finally stepping out of the back seat of his town car. His driver pretended not to notice the hesitation. Men like Adrian Mercer did not hesitate. Not before billion-dollar acquisitions. Not before television interviews. Not before hostile negotiations with investors twice his age. Yet somehow walking back into the restaurant where he had dismissed a quiet waitress less than 24 hours earlier felt strangely more difficult than any boardroom he had ever entered. Inside, the warm golden light of Leclerc House wrapped around polished marble floors and soft piano music drifting through the dining room. The dinner rush had already begun. Executives laughed over expensive bourbon near the bar while couples leaned close beneath crystal chandeliers. Nobody looked twice at Adrian when he entered. Most wealthy people inside the restaurant wore the same expensive confidence. But Adrian noticed Evelyn immediately. She moved between tables carrying a silver tray balanced carefully against one shoulder, blonde hair tied neatly back again despite the long shift ahead of her. Calm, focused, invisible to almost everyone except him. One of the younger servers noticed Adrian first and nearly panicked. "Mr. Mercer, welcome back." Several heads turned subtly after hearing the name. Adrian ignored them. "Is Evelyn working this section tonight?" The server blinked in surprise before nodding slowly. "Yes, sir." Adrian loosened the button on his coat slightly. "Then I would like to sit in her section." The young server looked genuinely confused by that request, but quickly guided him toward a quiet table near the windows overlooking Park Avenue. Rain slid softly across the glass while headlights blurred into ribbons of gold outside. Adrian sat alone beneath the chandelier light, pretending to review emails on his phone, though he barely read a single word. He was waiting. 5 minutes later, Evelyn approached the table holding a leather order booklet against her apron. She stopped the instant she recognized him. For the first time since meeting her, Adrian saw something flicker across her expression that looked dangerously close to uncertainty. "Mr. Mercer," she said politely, "I was not expecting to see you tonight." Adrian stood slightly out of instinct before sitting again. "Neither was I." Evelyn glanced briefly around the dining room before returning to professional calm. "Would you like the usual bourbon?" Adrian looked up at her carefully. "You remembered?" A faint pause followed. "You seem like someone who orders the same thing everywhere." Adrian almost smiled. "And what kind of person does that make me?" Evelyn opened the order booklet calmly. "Someone who prefers control over surprises." The answer landed harder than she probably intended. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair. "That accurate assessment come with the dinner service?" "Only for difficult customers." He laughed quietly before realizing it had been the first genuine laugh he had experienced all day. Evelyn seemed slightly surprised by it too. She looked away toward the rain-covered windows for a moment before speaking again. "So why are you here?" Adrian could have lied. Businessmen like him usually did when conversations became personal. But something about Evelyn Carter made dishonesty feel embarrassing. "I wanted to apologize properly." Her blue eyes returned to his face slowly. Adrian continued before he could reconsider the words. "Last night I treated you like you were insignificant before you spoke a single sentence." Evelyn remained still for a moment. Around them, silverware clinked softly while low jazz music drifted through the restaurant. Finally, she answered quietly. "Most people do." Adrian felt something tighten painfully in his chest after hearing how naturally she said it. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. He looked down briefly at the untouched menu in front of him. "You should not have to prove your intelligence to be treated with respect." Evelyn studied him carefully now as though deciding whether he actually believed that. Then she surprised him again. "No," she said softly. "But people like you usually only notice people after they become useful." Adrian looked up immediately. The words should have offended him. Instead, they felt uncomfortably true. Because 24 hours ago, he probably would have agreed with them. The words lingered heavily between them while rain traced slow patterns across the tall restaurant windows behind Adrian Mercer. Around them, Leclerc House continued moving with polished elegance. Servers carried trays beneath chandelier light. Wealthy guests laughed softly over wine and candlelight. But at the quiet table near the windows, something honest had entered the conversation for the first time. Adrian looked at Evelyn Carter carefully after her comment. "People like you usually only notice people after they become useful." Most executives would have rushed to defend themselves. Adrian almost did. Then he stopped. Because deep down, he knew she was right. For years his world had operated on value, profit, influence, efficiency. Every conversation became negotiation eventually. Every relationship carried invisible expectations attached to it. Even kindness often arrived with contracts hidden beneath the surface. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair and loosened his grip on the edge of the menu. "You are probably right," he admitted quietly. Evelyn blinked once, clearly not expecting agreement. Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile. "That surprises you." She lowered the order booklet slowly. Most powerful men do not apologize without explaining why they were justified first. Somewhere nearby, a waiter dropped a fork onto a serving tray with a sharp metallic sound before quickly apologizing to a customer. Soft jazz drifted through the dining room while candlelight flickered against crystal glasses. Adrian found himself studying Evelyn's expression again. There was intelligence there. Not the kind designed to impress people. The quieter kind. Observant. Careful. Dangerous in ways most people underestimated. "You make very quick assumptions about me," Adrian said calmly. Evelyn glanced toward the rain outside before answering. "No, I make quick observations." Adrian almost smiled again despite himself. "And what observation have you made tonight?" Evelyn hesitated briefly. Then she spoke with the same quiet honesty that seemed impossible for her to avoid. "You are trying very hard to understand why someone walked away from opportunities you think most people would do anything to have." Adrian's expression shifted slightly. She saw through people too easily. "And did I," he asked, "walk away from them?" Evelyn nodded once. "You already know the answer to that." Adrian thought about the report sitting on his desk upstairs in Mercer Tower. Columbia. Diplomatic recruitment offers. International consulting opportunities. All traded for hospital bills and late-night restaurant shifts. Most people would not have made the same choice, he admitted. Evelyn looked down briefly at the leather booklet in her hands. Most people did not watch their mother slowly forget who they were. The sentence hit him harder than anything else she had said all evening. Not dramatic, not emotional, just painfully simple. Adrian suddenly understood why she spoke so softly all the time. People carrying grief for long enough eventually stop wasting energy on loudness. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights outside reflected gold across the rain-covered glass, while traffic moved slowly through the wet Manhattan streets below. Finally, Adrian asked quietly, "Does she still recognize you?" Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the booklet. Small movement, almost invisible, but Adrian noticed. "Some days," she answered softly. "Some days she remembers every story from my childhood in perfect detail." Her eyes drifted toward the windows. Other days she asks where her daughter went. Adrian felt an unfamiliar ache settle in his chest after hearing that. Sympathy usually made him uncomfortable. It felt inefficient, uncontrolled. Yet sitting across from Evelyn Carter now, he realized how small most of his own problems suddenly sounded. Billion-dollar negotiations, investor pressure, corporate headlines. None of it compared to watching someone you loved slowly disappear one memory at a time. Evelyn straightened slightly then, returning to professionalism almost like instinct. "You should order something," she said quietly. "You have been sitting here 20 minutes without touching the menu." Adrian looked down at the unopened menu in front of him before meeting her eyes again. "What would you recommend?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Are you asking the waitress?" Adrian held her gaze calmly this time. "No," he said softly. "I am asking the smartest person I have met all week." For the first time since he walked back into the restaurant, Evelyn Carter did not immediately look away. For a brief moment, the noise of LeClaire House seemed to fade around them. The low jazz music, the quiet conversations, the soft clinking of silverware beneath crystal chandeliers. Adrian Mercer simply held Evelyn Carter's gaze across the candlelit table while rain shimmered against the windows behind her like liquid gold. Most people reacted visibly when he complimented them. They smiled too quickly, became nervous, tried harder. Evelyn did none of those things. She looked almost unsettled instead, as though sincerity itself made her uncomfortable. Then one of the kitchen staff called her name softly from across the dining room, breaking the silence between them. Evelyn blinked once and stepped back slightly. "I should get back to work." Adrian nodded slowly, though disappointment flickered through him before he could hide it. Strange. He could negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without emotional attachment. Yet the thought of this conversation ending suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Evelyn tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear before speaking again. The cedar salmon is usually safe here. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. Safe? A faint smile touched her lips. You seem like someone who avoids unnecessary risks. He almost laughed again. And if I wanted something less predictable? Evelyn studied him carefully for a second. Then order the braised short ribs. Adrian closed the menu immediately. I will trust your judgment. That answer seemed to surprise her more than the compliment earlier. She gave a small nod and disappeared toward the kitchen, moving quietly through the crowded restaurant like she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. Adrian watched her go longer than he should have. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Evelyn returned carrying his dinner plate beneath the warm chandelier glow. By then, most of the dinner crowd had changed. New guests filled the restaurant while rain continued falling softly over Manhattan outside. Adrian had barely touched the stack of business emails open on his phone. Instead, he found himself noticing things he normally ignored. The exhaustion hidden behind Evelyn's calm posture. The tiny pause before she smiled at difficult customers. The way she always checked on elderly guests before anyone else. Small things. Human things. Evelyn carefully placed the plate in front of him. Be honest, she said quietly. The short ribs are either excellent or terrible, depending on the chef's mood. Adrian looked down at the meal before him, then back up at her. You say that to all the customers? Only the ones who think honesty is refreshing. Adrian picked up the fork slowly. And do you? Evelyn crossed her arms lightly against the order booklet resting at her side. Do I what? Think honesty is refreshing. She glanced briefly toward the rain-covered windows. I think honesty is expensive. The sentence stayed with him long after she walked away again. Adrian tasted the food absently, barely noticing it was actually excellent. His attention kept drifting back toward Evelyn moving between tables beneath the soft golden light. Around 10:15, the dinner rush finally began slowing down. Candle flames flickered lower. Half-empty wine glasses reflected against polished marble surfaces. Near the front entrance, an elderly Chinese couple slowly stood to leave their table. Before any other server noticed, Evelyn crossed the room quickly to help the older woman with her coat. She spoke softly to them in Mandarin while adjusting the scarf around the woman's shoulders with gentle care. The older man smiled warmly before saying something that made Evelyn laugh quietly under her breath. Adrian stared at the scene without fully understanding why it affected him so strongly. There was no performance in her kindness. No calculation. She treated people carefully even when nobody important was watching. Especially then. Most wealthy men Adrian knew donated money publicly and ignored exhausted waiters privately. Evelyn had almost nothing, yet she carried herself with more grace than half the executives sitting inside Mercer Tower every day. When she returned toward his table again, Adrian spoke before thinking. You were happier just now. Evelyn paused slightly. With the older couple? Adrian nodded. You smiled differently. For a moment, Evelyn looked genuinely caught off guard. Then her expression softened almost imperceptibly. They reminded me of my mother before she became sick. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly. You miss her? Evelyn looked toward the windows again, where rain blurred the city lights into soft streaks across the glass. No, she said quietly. I miss the version of her that still remembers me. By 11:30, LeClaire House had grown quieter beneath the fading chandelier light. Most of the wealthy dinner crowd had disappeared into black town cars and penthouse elevators across Manhattan, while the remaining guests lingered over final glasses of wine and low conversations. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city streets glistened beneath reflections of traffic lights and storefront windows like wet ribbons of gold stretching through the night. Adrian Mercer remained seated at the same table long after finishing dinner. His empty glass sat untouched beside neatly folded linen napkins, while his phone buzzed periodically with messages he no longer cared enough to answer immediately. Across the restaurant, Evelyn Carter wiped down a marble counter near the espresso station with slow, tired movements. For the first time all evening, Adrian noticed how exhausted she truly looked. Not dramatic exhaustion, the quiet kind. The kind people carried for so long it became part of the way they moved through the world. One of the younger servers passed beside Evelyn and whispered something that made her smile faintly before disappearing into the kitchen. Adrian watched her for another moment before finally standing and walking toward the counter. Evelyn looked up as he approached. "You are still here," she said softly. "So are you." A small silence settled between them. Somewhere in the back kitchen, dishes clattered softly while the pianist near the staircase packed sheet music into a worn leather case. Evelyn folded the towel carefully beside the espresso machine. Most billionaires do not spend 4 hours sitting alone in restaurants. Adrian slipped one hand into the pocket of his coat. Most waitresses do not rescue international business negotiations. That earned the smallest hint of amusement in her eyes again. Adrian hesitated briefly before speaking. "I spoke with someone today about your background." Evelyn's expression changed instantly. Not fear exactly, more like disappointment. Quiet disappointment. She lowered her eyes toward the polished counter. "Of course you did." Adrian immediately regretted the sentence. "I was trying to understand." "No," Evelyn answered softly. "You were trying to explain me in a way that made sense to your world." The honesty of it hit harder because she never raised her voice. Adrian exhaled slowly. "You are right." Evelyn looked genuinely surprised again by the lack of defensiveness. Adrian continued carefully. "I learned about Colombia. Your mother. The offers you turned down." Her posture stiffened slightly beneath the warm light. "You had no right." "I know." Silence again. Heavy this time. Adrian looked toward the dark windows where reflections of the restaurant floated across the glass beside the glowing city outside. "But after last night, I could not stop wondering how someone like you ended up here." Evelyn crossed her arms lightly against herself. "And now that you know?" Adrian looked back at her slowly. "Now I think this city failed you." Evelyn's eyes softened for the briefest moment before hardening again with quiet restraint. "No," she said gently. "Life happened. There is a difference." Adrian stared at her. Most people in painful situations searched desperately for someone to blame. Evelyn carried responsibility instead. That difference suddenly felt enormous. "You should have had more choices," Adrian said quietly. Evelyn looked down toward the espresso machine before answering. "I did have a choice." Adrian frowned slightly. Leaving school was not really a choice. "Yes, it was." She met his gaze directly now. Calm. Certain. "My mother spent 20 years sacrificing everything so I could have opportunities she never had. When she became sick, I decided she would not face that alone." Adrian felt the weight of her words settle somewhere deep in his chest. Evelyn continued softly. "People always talk about ambition like it is the most important thing in the world." Her eyes drifted toward the empty restaurant around them. "But sometimes love asks you to become someone entirely different than who you plan to be." Adrian looked at her for a long moment without speaking. In boardrooms, he had spent his entire life measuring people by results. Intelligence, strategy, influence. Yet standing here now beside a quiet waitress cleaning espresso cups after midnight, Adrian suddenly realized he had almost never measured people by sacrifice. And somehow, that seemed far more important. 3 weeks later, the first snow of December drifted quietly over Manhattan, softening the noise of the city beneath a pale silver sky. Inside Mercer Tower, executives rushed through hallways carrying tablets and financial reports while giant screens displayed international market numbers across the 63rd floor conference room. But Adrian Mercer barely noticed any of it anymore. His attention had changed in ways he still did not fully understand. The Shanghai partnership had officially closed 2 days earlier. It became one of the largest international deals Mercer Holdings had ever completed. Business magazines called Adrian brilliant again. Investors praised his leadership. Television analysts discussed strategy and market expansion late into the night. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew the deal had only survived because a quiet waitress carrying water glasses understood people better than an entire room full of executives. Adrian never corrected the story publicly. Evelyn would have hated the attention. But he never forgot either. On a cold Thursday evening, Adrian stepped out of his town car in Queens carrying 2 paper coffee cups while snow drifted gently across the sidewalks. The memory care facility stood quietly between an old church and a small grocery store glowing warm against the winter dark. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly like tea and clean linen. Soft piano music played somewhere down the hallway. Adrian found Evelyn sitting beside a window in the visitor lounge, helping her mother fold paper cranes from colored napkins. For a moment, he simply stood there unnoticed. Evelyn looked different outside the restaurant. Softer somehow. Less guarded. Her mother smiled faintly, while Evelyn carefully guided trembling hands through another fold of paper. "No, Mama." Evelyn whispered gently in Mandarin. "Like this." Her mother laughed quietly after making another mistake. The sound carried something fragile and beautiful inside it. Adrian suddenly understood why Evelyn gave up everything without regret. Some people were simply worth more than ambition. Evelyn finally looked up and noticed him standing near the doorway holding coffee. Surprise crossed her face first. Then warmth. Real warmth this time. Adrian walked over slowly and handed her one of the cups. "Hazelnut latte," he said quietly. "You remembered," Evelyn answered softly. Adrian sat beside her while snow drifted silently outside the large windows. Her mother studied him curiously for a moment before speaking to Evelyn in Mandarin. Evelyn laughed under her breath. "What did she say?" Adrian asked. Evelyn smiled into the steam rising from her coffee cup. "She asked why the handsome businessman keeps looking at me like he forgot something important." Adrian looked down briefly, caught off guard by the unexpected honesty. Then he smiled quietly too. "And what did you tell her?" Evelyn watched snow gather softly along the edge of the windows outside before answering. "That maybe you remembered something instead." Neither of them spoke after that. They simply sat together beneath the warm light of the small visitor lounge while Evelyn's mother folded another paper crane with patient hands. For once, Adrian Mercer did not feel the need to control the silence. He understood it now. Some people walk into your life loudly, demanding attention the moment they arrive. But the ones who truly change you usually do it quietly, with kindness, with dignity, with truths so gentle they force the world around them to become softer too. And sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is not the billionaire at the head of the table. Sometimes it is the quiet woman no one noticed until she finally spoke. If this story reminded you that kindness and intelligence often hide behind the people the world overlooks, let us know in the comments. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be remembered too, you are always welcome to stay for the next story.